The Gentlementor.
When you talk about like, again, yeah, grew up the same kind of time period, and there was no pedophilia back then, except that I grew up, and now talking to the people that I grew up with, it was everywhere. It was just that nobody talked
Yeah.
about it. It was
Yeah.
the big
There
no-no.
may
You
have been
just
more
didn't
of
say
it then, actually, as a result of the fact
Quite
that
possibly.
Yeah.
about,
Frighteningly possible.
um, kids have better defenses for what the world might throw at them. At least in a lot of cases, they do.
Well,
You
there's
know?
preparedness. You talk stranger danger and stuff like that. I
All that
grew.
stuff.
I grew up. Can I ask how old a guy you are? I'm sorry, I didn't even ask that early, unless that's
Sure,
too.
I'm 63.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I grew up around the same time. Yeah, and it was like I said, we had no idea, but it's because it wasn't on the news. There were no stranger danger. Don't talk to people. Don't do this.
Well,
It was.
I was going to say this is how it was also complicated, which was that you were told to never get in a car with a stranger, right? But you were also always told to obey adults. So what could go wrong with those two things? You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Interesting.
So,
Yeah.
Crazy stuff, man. Tell us about the experience. I mean, like, again, as much detail as you want. I want you to spoil your book. We want people to be enticed to go get it and read it, because I think obviously you've done something amazing here. So just as much as you want to share about the book, go ahead. The process of writing it, the process of deciding that that's what you were going to do, that must have been arduous. I mean, I can imagine that writing, the actual physical labor of having to draw that stuff out, because you're reliving every bit of that. And in high definition, probably.
Right.
No,
recreate it.
And I do get asked this, was it like difficult to draw this? It must have been. And the answer is kind of odd, because in actual fact, drawing this book was more fun than drawing any comic I've ever drawn. So that was an interesting turn of events. I would not really have expected that.
Why was that, do you think? Because it was a release?
I think it was probably. I think it was just the catharsis of it. And also, like, I believe that as a cartoonist, you are a little bit of a troublemaker. You're supposed to be.
Okay.
You're supposed to be doing shit you're not supposed to be doing if you're a cartoonist.
Because that makes a great story.
Well, there's just a rebellious aspect to cartooning, where what you are doing is you are saying what you've been told not to say. I really believe that that's a piece of it. And doing Chartwell Manor, that's really a story you're not supposed to say, because that's too much shit that went on. So there's an enormous cathartic aspect to that, to actually be drawing all of this. But at the same time, the release was also the fact that I had found a way to tell the story. Now, I grew up drawing, underground comics and what they used to call pamphlets, which was like, a 32-page book or something like that. And to make the leap into the graphic novel memoir is to deal with a much wider scope, a lot more pages, a lot more work, just a much bigger project. And to find my way into that and find that I could tell it on this level of 200 plus pages was very exciting. And in a lot of ways, the book actually drew itself, was my feeling.
That's cool.
Which was fortunate, because it would have been a real bitch if it was difficult to draw.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. And I had actually attempted drawing this something like 30 years ago, and I was not able to get a handle on it. My drawing style had not become expressive enough, and it's very expressive in most respects, I would say, in terms of the brushwork and all that. So it's a very emotional looking style visually, which was also, I think, very appropriate and helped the book. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the process of doing it, I made sure to have the whole thing completely written out. I would not ever attempt making it up as you go along. I don't know if anybody still does that. That used to be an underground comics thing. A lot of cartoonists were doing that, and it would really show, because by the time the story ended, it would be kind of like, oh, well, that's over. That's all, folks. There was a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So this book, Chartwell Manor, was actually written very carefully as a 5-chapter book. The first chapter is the boarding school. That's about 80 pages. The second chapter is post Chartwell, meaning high school. And the third chapter leaps ahead and actually kind of loops back to that beginning that you mentioned, where my character is, guzzling beer, and he's back in that seedy rooming house situation. That's about 10 years after the high school experience. And that dissolution chapter leads to getting sober. And then the next two chapters that follow, the last of them, are about life and what life is like, coming to grips with what that experience was. So reliving it in a way that is with a great deal of clarity, because it takes a while to really see things really clearly once you've been sober. It doesn't happen right away.
Yeah.
It also doesn't happen that you can face your demons or the demons that have haunted you throughout your life right away either. So it takes a while to get there.
True.
Yeah,
agreed, and hardly, yes.
Yeah, so that was a big process, but that wasn't difficult either. The writing of it, I knew where this book was going to have to go, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I had a pretty good feeling about what was going to go where in terms of the writing of it. So mostly that all came together. And
fortunately, just getting enough distance to have the headspace to see it, so you could, I guess, have the perspective.
Yeah, and I was going to add that my wife, who is also very creative, she teaches creative nonfiction as well as being a good writer. She was very good to show my work too, and this is something that very important. I think about this a lot whenever I look into how filmmakers work. That sometimes they write their own scripts, but even when they do, they've got other people in there that are usually in on it.
Right.
They definitely have a film editor. So after they've shot the movie, they're going to be talking to does this scene work? Does that scene work? Do I get rid of that? So my wife was actually very important in this context, just with showing her what I had written, and we would go over it and we would look at it. She wouldn't rewrite anything, but we would talk stuff through. And I think it's very important.
In-house editorial process.
Yeah, it's very important to have that.
I bet that would be amazingly handy.
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, it's one of the things I learned in art school was that you've got to be able to back up what you've just drawn. You can't just say, well, I don't know, man, I drew it. Don't ask me these questions. You can't do that. You've got to be able to answer for it, So. Yeah.
So you were in Chartwell how long exactly?
I was there for 2 years, actually. From
there 2 years, and then again, I don't want to spoil the book. And what happens? You get shot back out into the world of normalcy again for high school.
Actually, by that point, I got sent to a different kind of school, which was a private school. There was a prep school, which also really sucked, but just in a different way. At least it was safe. You know what I mean?
Different variety of suction.
Yeah, but it was not terrible. It was at least safe.
So while you're in this place is when you kind of made your this is art is what I want to do. And you said, so post high school, are you ready to go? Do you go to college, design school, or are you fighting those demons? And for me, the demons got a couple of years before I could even think about college. I needed to go and run and be stupid for a while before I could even get, okay, well, now I'm going to get serious.
I had a good bit of that too. And I don't know if I would have, either way, whether I'd been to Chartwell Manor or not, but I definitely bummed around a bit. My previous book, actually, a book I did that was another memoir, it's called Chicago, which is where I dropped out of art school in Cleveland and thumbed out to Chicago and met some underground cartoonists there, but it was basically living on the street. And those experiences that we have leading up to getting our shit together are actually
the stages of getting our shit together.
More interesting than when we've got our shit together.
Well, sure.
I'm just out of place. If you guys have your shit together, then I need to get mine going here.
It's stages. It's stages.
Oh, it's stages. Okay, all right.
It's never really together. You're just a little more together than you used to be.
Oh, gotcha.
It's competition against yourself.
You're not driving into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. You're driving at 60.
Okay, all right. So you're backing off a little bit of time.
Moderation.
Seatbelt on too, and so you tend to walk away.
This would be, and this is kind of where I was going with this. I wanted to give you an opportunity. I actually didn't want to give you an opportunity. I'm being totally selfish. I wanted to hear you talk about your other comic books. Like what are those about? If you want to kind of give us a overview, you kind of did there one. If so,
I saw a little bit of Chicago. Yeah.
You want to, if you want to just go ahead and leapfrog from there, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was really involved in anthologies for a while too. See, I used to edit comics, and that was also really good. I would recommend editing for anybody who gets into, I don't know, any art form, whether it's film or comics or writing. It's just like editing. It tends to be really helpful for you because what it does is like, an editor is basically a writer, and a critic, and a critic is a writer too. It's somebody who's looking at the written word, whether it's their own or somebody else's, and thinking, how could this be better? What would make this better? And because I was involved in doing that, I edited a couple of anthologies. The first one came out in the late 80s, early 90s, called Snake Eyes, which I edited with another cartoonist, a friend of mine named Kaz, and an excellent artist, and got a lot of other excellent artists in it. And that actually got the door open for me with Fantagraphics, my publisher, because I was able to bring them something that was really good, which they wanted. And I wasn't just doing it for me, I was doing it for a lot of artists. So it wasn't just an ego trip like it would have been if I brought my first book to them. So I did that for a few issues. And then I also did it with another book later called Hotwire, which was in the 2000s. And yeah, both those books were good. And they definitely solidified me with my publisher enough that I can bring stuff to them, or at least that's what I think happened. They were very happy with Chartwell Manor, and they seemed to be pretty happy with Chicago as well. So I did that a lot. And I did other comics too, in terms of solo books. And I did a lot of stuff about living on the Lower East Side and about, New York City grunge type environment type crime type stuff. And I think crime has always been on the horizon for me. Like I loved crime comics, like the 1940s crime comics and crime movies. And when I say I think it was always on the horizon for me, I think it was probably because there was some understanding that I would at some point have to delve into the crime of my life, which was Chartwell Manor. So I was going to have to deal with what that meant, what that law breaking was really like, how it really affects people, and what the after effects of it are. And that also was going into like a deeper level of narrative and concept than the usual thing that I was really into, which was just trying to be an entertainer, which is something that you have to take on board as a cartoonist and a comic book artist, which is, you got to tell stories.
If it's not entertaining, nobody will read it.
Right, exactly. And you never get away from that. I haven't left that behind with, like I was saying earlier, if I'm going to draw a graphic novel, it better be good. It better read good. It better look really good. It better really have everything that I would want if I was going to plunk down 25 or 30 bucks on it. Right. So you never can escape that. I mean, that's the thing that's great about comics, like film. It's art meets commerce. It never can escape from that.
Yeah. So you had mentioned before, we were talking about the purpose of the book and talking about the book, and you said that one of the, maybe the main purpose, one of the main purposes behind the book was dealing with this in view or in front of or in the minds of your parents and how they would receive it. Can you talk about how any of that went? Or again, as always, I just keep caveating as much as you want to share.
Yeah. Well, what I was saying was that like the essential drama in the book ultimately, isn't the boarding school. It's the acceptance or lack thereof of what that experience was. and how my character deals with that, and how my parents deal with that, and what all that means. So that's kind of the gist of it. And I mean, in truth, you know, if you're really taking the memoir seriously, it tends to go towards family. It tends to go towards childhood. It tends to really have to delve into that, because if you really start delving into your memory, you're going to see, obviously, and even if you don't, you might see it, that so much of who you are and what you are has been shaped by these childhood experiences. So you're going to go there.
Yes.
And that's what this book did. So in terms of how it affected my parents, well, they're dead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was like a moment where you like sat down and said, "Hey, I want you to know this happened to me." Like, was that a moment that happened in your life, or maybe not?
Well, it happened in the book to a certain extent. That like that, there's a confrontational moment in the later part of the book with me and my mom that happens, and yeah, I won't give away anything else about what happened there, but the question itself interests me that you asked, because here's one thing I will say. If you've done a good memoir, if you've done your job right, there will be blood, or rather, there will be fallout. That will happen. Okay, and you never know where it's going to happen. You know, it could have been, for instance, some of the grown-ups who had been kids at Chartwell Manor who I drew, one of whom I didn't even change his name. And he did read the book because he saw that article in the New York Post about it. And this particular guy actually was instrumental in getting Lynch locked up. So in a way, he's the hero, but he was also really badly affected by the experience there, you know? So, like I'm saying, you never know where the fallout's going to be. Where it actually was, as far as I can tell you, was with my sisters. Because
Interesting.
Yeah, the book comes out, it's getting all this press, so they're very aware of it, and so they bought it, and this is right after my mom had died. So here's the thing, you know, with memoir, again, if you're doing it right, you're trying to be as objective as possible. That's your job. You're really supposed to be going for the truth. Now, families don't necessarily go in for that. And I'm not saying doing anything harsh, because I really say this in the foreword to the book too, that I went as far as I could into not making anyone look either good or bad, especially myself. But families, in most instances, would prefer something hagiographic to something that's truth-telling. They're not really looking for the truth-telling, man. That's not really part of it's not what the company, you know, store is really selling. So that's where you run into trouble, or at least that's where you can. And as I'm saying, you're going to run into trouble. If you're doing your job right, you're going to run into trouble. It's just going to happen.
For sure.
You know, that's the risk of memoir, is that you are working. I'm used to working with cartoon characters, but you got to get used to cartoon characters that are not just cartoon characters, but they're also people who might like take you to task for something that you did.
Cartoons with a soul.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm one too.
So, okay. So here's a two-part question for you. What advice would you give someone, this one piece of advice that you give someone in your position years ago, trying to make it as an artist, any type of art form, that they're trying to get out there, they're trying to get their stuff published, they're trying to get noticed, they're trying to be better at what they are? What would be one piece of advice you'd give someone like that?
I would probably give the advice that I have on my bulletin board, which is a quote from a European artist by the name of Bruno Richard, whose work is pretty crazy and pretty great. And the quote is, "Make the work that only you can do." And that, for my money, says it all.
Wow. That's good.
Because the problem that every artist has to juggle and I mentioned earlier that comics are a matter of art and commerce, right?
Yeah.
Well, you can really get hung up on the commerce, and you can be like, man, if this doesn't, get me rich, or if this doesn't move my career along and all that stuff, which of course you have to, you've got to deal with that. But if you focus just on making the work that only you can do, that will hold you in good stead.
Yeah.
That will get you someplace.
Yeah.
So that's the thing I would tell anybody to try to think about, because there's so many competing voices for an artist to have to overcome.
Yeah.
That making the work that only you can do, and that means essentially trying to find out your voice and trying to follow it wherever it leads you, is probably the best advice you could have, because there's going to be all kinds of pitfalls. There's going to be all kinds of things that are going to try to get you to stop.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And not going to be always that many people who are clamoring for more of your work. And so that's what I would really suggest, is to try to go for that more than anything else. Just trying to make the work that only you can do. That's true to you,
Yeah. That's good. That's solid. All right. Part 2. Someone who has experienced in their life an abusive situation, and here they are coping, dealing, trying to figure out what to do. What's the next step? What is your advice on helping them move forward? What would be the one thing that you would say to them, to someone who's just, this is in my past and I've got to get over it. I just don't know how.
That's a really good question, and it's really hard to know how to answer it, because everybody processes these things completely differently.
Yeah.
Like I always think of this thing I read years back about, these horrible criminal situation that happened to these Korean comfort women, they were called. And what they were was like, they were prisoners. They'd been abducted by the Japanese, and they were put in to forced prostitution, and they were called comfort women, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the thing that it always struck me was that one of these women, she was in that situation as a comfort woman, meaning, I'm assuming, raped for about an afternoon. After that afternoon, she killed herself, right? Mm. Now, the thing that's interesting, there are other women, Korean women, that have lobbied and been political powerhouses for years in recent decades to become recognized by the Japanese and by their own country and by the world for what happened to them. Mm-hmm. Now, those women, they didn't suffer it for an afternoon, they suffered it for years, okay? And yet, they somehow had the wherewithal to go public and get their stories out there. So the point I'm making with this is that all different people are affected all different ways, sure, by whatever kind of bad situations they have in life. I consider myself luckier than my classmates, my former classmates from boarding school, partly because I had my art as an outlet and a safety valve for all this stuff, and partly because I was making that art, I was at a little bit more of a remove from my headmaster than they were. See, I wasn't just living that life I was in. I was also, taking a step back and drawing. And drawing is a safer thing to do for a kid than just, going apeshit and doing whatever all the other kids are doing.
Right.
I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that it's just going to vary from person to person, and that what has to be accepted is that the healing process takes a long time. That's the other thing I would say. Life gets better as you are healing from what you're healing from. But having, gotten sober from drinking, that's the thing that really hits you. They would say, I wish you a slow recovery. And, that sounds like an odd statement until you realize what that means, is that it will take you quite some time to recover from all the things you've been through. You've been affected by them. So,
man,
it's going to take.
I'm going to bang the gong here for 3 things Glenn has said tonight that I just think need to be repeated. When you bury stuff in the basement, it festers. It gets rotten. It gets nasty. When you bury stuff in your life, you don't take it out. You don't put it in the light. You don't put it out where it can be exposed and get rid of it. It'll tell you all kinds of lies about how you're going to be ashamed and how you're going to be abandoned to keep in that secret place. But your great power is to put it out. Is to face the shame and whatever you have to do, get it out of that dark place. The next two things are what you just said. First of well, you said this earlier, is that healing does not begin immediately. It takes time. You have to have distance between yourself and that trauma to be able to shift your perspective so you can see it and begin to deal with it. And the third thing is what you just said. Healing is not instant. Yeah. It is a process. But every day of that process will get better and better over time. Man, that's gold. Out of the park. That's what you just did. Hit it out of the park. You've talked about, you kind of brushed up on this earlier about talking to some of these guys who went through this experience. You said, I think you said it's actually, you reference it in the book that there's a meeting.
Correct,
with you. I'm wondering about that in the real world. Like what you mentioned one there before. What else have you heard from people who were there and have read your book? What have they had to say? How is it affecting them in their journey to heal, hopefully?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can say to that is that, like, fortunately, this book has been very favorably received by everybody, including former students. So I haven't had anything difficult as a result of that. Really, like I was just saying, the only difficult thing that came back at me was, I think how my sister saw it. I think that was difficult for them. And we haven't even talked about it, which is a lot about, that's this Midwestern thing. I hope you guys don't mind my saying this, but like that's been my experience of the Midwestern mindset, at least with my parents anyway. And this is referenced in the book actually, that like they came out of the Midwest and they arrived in New Jersey, and my dad's on Wall Street and all this kind of stuff. And I think that there can be a tendency amongst any kind of immigrant, if you can say that that's immigrating or emigrating from the Midwest to the East Coast, is to bury some of what you had, some of what happened. You got this.
That's why people go from one place to another, is to leave the past behind.
Yeah,
sure. That's a lot of the dream. We want to go have a new beginning.
Living in New York, that's what New York is really about. When you're in New York, you're not where you're from.
Right.
You're in New York. You're a New Yorker. So we all deal with that to some extent. But it's this thing of like burying it and.
Yeah. I was actually wondering. Here's my kind of where I'm coming from on this. We have ministry background, and one of the things, many things that I love about the Bible is this idea of the Bible says to take your sword and your spear and you beat them into a plowshare. And I've always reflected on that idea as kind of the Bible telling us that what we can do is we can take things that injured us, and if we'll do the work of hammering them and reshaping them, we can turn them into tools that actually help. So we take something that's destructive and it becomes constructive. I'm wondering, are you hearing from other people that have had either this specific experience at Chartwell or similar, where this book is like giving them something to stand on and the ability to take some ground back, some hope, something?
I've had a lot of that actually.
Anything you want to share there? I mean, you don't have to, again, specific as you want. You don't have to say names or...
I can't even recall the specifics. There's just been a lot of, the book came out last May, and there's been a lot of people that reacted to it that way. And in some cases, it would be that they had some similar things happen to them as happened to me. In other cases, it was that they hadn't, but they could still completely identify with what the experiences were like and all that, which is good. I mean, you want it. You want your story to be universal that way. You want it to be able to have that kind of impact so that people can get it and feel for what you've been through. But I like that. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I've heard that quote about beating swords into plowshares, and I didn't know that that's what it meant.
I can't swear that that's what it means. I didn't write the book. I get to read it and study it. It's a thought that has always stuck with me. And I've shared with Mark earlier, it's really weird to me that like since the beginning of the year, we keep running into people with not this story, because nobody else got this story, Glenn. This is yours. You followed your first commandment. Do the work only you can do.
Only you can do.
You did that. But I'm taking this trauma from my past and I'm going to offer this up. I'm going to put it on display. There's no way to seek glory from that. You're not looking, you're not expecting a pat on the head. But when it changes someone else's life, when it affects someone, that's effectively what you've done. You've taken something that was meant to destroy you and you've turned it around and used it to help somebody else. I don't think there's a more inspirational story. That's why when I saw this as the backstory for why you're doing it, I started following you because I liked your art. I just liked the way it looked. It reminds me of a lot of my childhood things that I liked art-wise. You do a lot of Basil Wolverton and Mad Magazine and all this stuff. You're just talking to me. And I'm like, I hear what this guy's saying. I had no idea you had this story behind this. When you started running that stuff, I was like, wait a minute. In fact, I think I talked to him that day. I'm like, dude, I've been following this guy. He does this great artwork. I had no idea what was behind it. And when I heard it, I'm like, oh, man, it's another spear. It's another sword getting beaten into a plowshare. It's something built for destruction being turned into productivity. And I'm
one thing I should add here, though, is, just to tell on myself, I have my own selfish motives for doing a book like this.
If you didn't, it would never have gotten done. I'm not trying to promote you to like.
And that's all.
Or anything, I know, but I'm just trying to add that, like, see, one thing that like I really looked at was, like, as I said, how can I turn this into a movie? And also, how can I turn this into a movie that people will want to watch?
Yeah.
That's the thing. I'm always looking at that. As somebody once said, the commercial and the creative are inextricably intertwined, and you deal with that. You know what I mean? And so, like, I loved drawing Lynch. That's the headmaster in this story. I loved drawing this guy because he's just such a cartoon character. He was this pompous, blowhard, liar, pedophile, charismatic, scumbag,
narcissistic.
Big personality, though. And, like, big personalities, man, they are always good to draw. They're like Falstaff, they're just
begging for it.
Because they're constantly in action and they're hustling and they're scamming and they never stop. And those guys are just good characters. So from a cartoonist standpoint, your enemy is blandness. You know what I mean? The worst kind of comics are the ones that are bland. The worst kind of anything is what's bland. I mean, you don't want that. You want something that, in other words, also, I was trying to do a book that would be undeniable, meaning you might love it, you might hate it, but you won't, like, read it and say, oh, yes, very nice. You're not gonna have that kind of reaction. I won't stand for that, I won't have it,
Right on. I'm totally down with that philosophy. That strikes me just right. I think you were talking about the commercial and the artistic. That argument that we have. I think every artist has about how commercial art can you be and still be true to your art. I heard as a songwriter, I've had that because I want to write a song where I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm going to do something completely real. But you realize if you do that, nobody's going to want to listen to it. And what you really want is you want people to listen and relate. That's what's behind the heart of an artist. And I heard Chris Stapleton say something a couple years ago that kind of changed me philosophically about that. And he said, I don't even think my song is finished until an audience has heard it. Mm-hmm. And it was like,
that's good.
Wow, that kind of puts it past that question of the commercial. And it brings it back to that thing of what we really want is to make a connection with other human beings. I want to tell you my story, and I want to see in your face and see in your reaction that you understand and relate, even if you didn't go through it, and you still accept me as a person.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, like, one of those signal moments that I first had. I was probably in high school when, I was just into the art and hadn't thought much more beyond it. And somebody brought up that phrase about, like, a tree falling in the forest and nobody hearing it. Did it even fall? And you know where that story's going and what the idea behind that is. And once that hits you and you're an aspiring artist, you really realize you got your work cut out for you, because there's a lot of people out there with their hatchets and their trees, man, and they're all trying to get heard. So you better find a way. You know what I mean? So.
Tremendous stuff, Glenn. Man, I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you took the time to do this thing.
So I love this because I can relate well. My dad passed away about a year ago. He was a caricature artist, so he did caricatures. So he'd go to different events and just sit with his easel and draw caricatures. And I could doodle a little bit fairly well, but I just was not the kind of skill that he had to be able to do characters with that. So yeah, I mean,
that's the thing. You know, you realize there's all these different kinds of artistic skills that different artists, cartoonists have, all different. And everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. You know, I've definitely seen a lot of that in the comics game, that there are people that can really do this really well, but not that. And
well, you're doing really well at telling a story, that's for sure, from the first few pages that I got to read. And the art in this really draws in the viewer. And I like the black and white because it gives me the ability to color that in my mind. So it still gives me some creative license, I guess, as I read that, because then I can add those colors or leave them as dim and black and white as they deserve to be because of the nature of what's being told. I think it's brilliant. I love it.
So Glenn actually allowed you to take part in the creative part.
That's the way I feel. He gave me creative license so I could do it. I love it. It's great.
Glenn, thank you again, man.
Thank you so much.
Happy birthday to you and your wife. And
thanks, Mark. Thanks, Doug. Even though the birthday was not today.
I know. I want to leave another one. Another birthday could come up. I hate being a thoughtless guest, and I just want to thank you again for taking the time, man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So appreciate it, Glenn.
Mark.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Glenn.
for taking the time, man. We really
appreciate it, sir.
You.
So
Thank
much.
You.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Bye.
The Gentlementor.